Hi everyone and welcome to Tasting History. Today we're making Hippocras. It's a medieval spiced wine. You might know it as one of the drinks that they're constantly imbibing on Game of Thrones. It is one of the easiest recipes I've done yet, and it is one of the hardest recipes I've done yet. Easy because other than just grinding up spices and waiting a day, there's not a lot to do. Hardest because getting the spices, not simple, especially during quarantine. So today I'll teach you how to make your own Hippocras at home and give you a few cheats just in case you don't feel like scouring the globe for certain spices. Because frankly, unless you're studying to become a sommelier, wine should not be a source of stress for anyone. So let us make like Cersei Lannister and get ourselves a glass of Hippocras, this time on Tasting History. Now there are dozens of recipes for this drink, but I am going to go to my old standby, the Forme of Cury, the 14th century recipe book from England. It's one of, if not the first recipe to use the term Hippocras, and what's interesting is most of the recipes in the Forme of Cury are in Middle English, but this one, and only this one, is in a weird bastardized 14th century French. So I'm actually going to put the original French recipe alongside the modern translation so you can see where we get some of the words. I think you'll understand a lot more than you might think. Pur Fait Ypocras, to make Hippocras. 3 ounces of cinnamon and 3 ounces of ginger. Spikenard of Spain, the size of a denier, a small French silver coin. Galangal, cloves, long pepper, nutmeg, marjoram, cardamom, a 1/4 ounce, 1/10 ounce grains of paradys, and powdered cinnamon, etc. You could never get away with just saying etc. at the end of a modern day recipe, but whatever. Now it's interesting because this recipe gives us very exact amounts for each of the ingredients, which is not common in a 14th century recipe. But what it doesn't give us is any instruction on what to do with these ingredients, and it's missing one rather key ingredient, the wine. So to crack this nut, I have scoured several later recipes to find clues on exactly the method to make the drink and how much wine to use, and what kind of wine to use. Also, some of the later recipes offer more easy to find spices, so I'll mention those as alternatives to things like spikenard, not easy to find. So before we get started, make sure to hit that like button while you contemplate how many times I had to re-record that last section because I kept saying hippogriff when I meant to say Hippocras. Womp womp. So first, the wine. Good news, you can pretty much use whatever you want because they mention everything. Red, white, sweet, dry, didn't really matter, so it is up to you. Now as far as how much wine, that is a little bit harder. It wasn't until 1660 that I found a recipe, I didn't find it in 1660, a 1660 recipe from The Accomplished Cook by Robert May where he specifies 1 gallon of wine for a recipe that has 3 ounces of cinnamon, which is the same amount of cinnamon that we're using in our recipe, so I figure that's going to be about right. Now, a gallon of wine back then was a very common way of bottling it, so it makes sense. I'm not going to make a gallon, so I will adjust the amounts to make quite a bit less. Now, other than using 3 ounces of cinnamon, Robert May's recipe is vastly different from the one that we're using today from the Forme of Cury. First, it includes cream, which is interesting in wine, and second, it has 3 pounds of sugar. 3 pounds of sugar. That's a lot of sugar. Our recipe doesn't use sugar at all. Most recipes actually do include a bit of sugar, but I want to stick to the Forme of Cury, so as much as I love sweet things, I will not be adding sugar. Now when it comes to the method, they also run the gamut. Some have you heating the wine, some don't. Some have very complex methods of adding spices and removing spices the next day and adding other spices using 3 different pots and a lot. And then some of them are just like throw the spices in, wait a day, and then strain it. That's the one that we're going to use because why not? So for this recipe, you will need 2 bottles or 1,500 milliliters of red or white wine, 1 ounce or 28 grams of cinnamon sticks, 1 ounce or 28 grams of fresh ginger, a 1/4 teaspoon of spikenard. Now I had never heard of spikenard, though I found out that it's also called nard, which was the oil that Mary Magdalene used to clean Jesus' feet when they were at the house of Lazarus, so kind of cool. But I didn't know what it smelled or tasted like. And it's It's so interesting because really I've never smelled anything quite like it. It's musky and earthy, yet extremely sweet and clean at the same time. It almost reminds me of the scent of the desert after it rains. If you've ever been in the desert after it rains, I grew up in Arizona, so I know that smell well. 1 teaspoon of galangal, 1 teaspoon of cloves. They could have been cloves like we use today, or they could have been gillyflower clove. Unfortunately, the same term was used throughout history to mean two different things. So nobody really knows. Everyone will debate, but we're going to use cloves, regular old cloves. 1 teaspoon of long pepper. Here's another one that you might not know. It kind of looks like a stretched out pine cone to me. And it tastes like pepper, like regular black pepper, but sweeter and at the same time quite a bit hotter. So very interesting, worth finding if you can. 1 teaspoon of nutmeg, 1 teaspoon of marjoram, 1 teaspoon of cardamom, half a teaspoon of grains of paradys. Now this is the one that took forever to get here. I guess you can sometimes find it in some stores, but during quarantine I couldn't, and I had to order it from a farm in Ghana. It took 4 months to get here. When I tasted it, and I just tasted one little kernel, or corn I guess, and it had kind of a sweet peppery flavor mixed with something a little bit more aromatic than regular pepper. And then all of a sudden, a wave of heat that was like I had just eaten a tablespoon of black pepper. It was very interesting. And a half teaspoon of ground cinnamon. So like I said, some of those spices are going to be a little hard to find, so if you're in a hurry to get your hippocras on, sounds like hippocroissant, weird, then go ahead and use some more nutmeg, black pepper, powdered ginger, and even rosemary, because all of those are mentioned in later recipes. And of course, if you want to sweeten it up, you can use sugar, which was considered a spice then. So the first thing to do is pour your wine into a large container. Then break up your cinnamon sticks and chop your fresh ginger, then grind up the rest of your spices. And they don't need to be ground up super fine, so just do your best. And I apologize to marjoram, which is technically an herb and not a spice, but it's all a little weird. Now, while spices are not as expensive as they were in the 14th century, they are still kind of expensive, especially some of those harder to find ones. So I wanted to thank several of my patrons, the marshals of the spicery, for helping me afford such luxurious items. I doff my cap to you all, if I only had a cap. If I only had a cap. So once you've ground your spices, start adding them directly into the wine and give everything a good mix. And then we wait, about a day, even 2. Every once in a while you can go ahead and give it another mix, but really just leave it in the pitcher and let the spices do their work. And while we wait, it is the perfect excuse to take a look at why Europe fell in love with Hippocras. He drinketh Hippocras claret and vernage, of spices hot to increasen his courage. And essentially that means he drank spice wines to increase his desire. Grrr. No wonder it stayed popular for so long. One of the first recipes we have for spiced wine comes from the Apicius Dere Coquinaria from the 4th century, and the very first 2 recipes in the collection are for spiced wine surprise and spiced honey wine for travelers. By the early Middle Ages, a drink called piment crops up in several manuscripts from Catalan in modern Spain. And in the 1180s, Chrétien de Troyes wrote an Arthurian legend about the quest for the Holy Grail, during which Sir Percival drinks a cup of piment after each meal. For some reason, the term piment falls out of use and is replaced in the 14th century by Hippocras, or Ypocras. This is probably due to the fact that the spices were drained out of a manicum hippocraticum, or Hippocratic sleeve, a popular tool of your friendly neighborhood apothecary. It was a conical cloth bag devised by the 5th century BC physician Hippocrates. Now right about now you're probably asking, why are people adding all these spices to the wine? Why not just drink the wine? And there are 3 popular theories. For the first, we have to trot out those 4 old chestnuts, the humors. Come on out here, you crazy guys. We have blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Often attributed to Hippocrates himself, Medieval medicine was all about controlling your humors and keeping them in balance to stay healthy. And I go into more detail in another video on the Black Plague and the 4 humors, which I'll link in the description, but essentially one way to control your humors was through food. And each food was given different degrees of hot, cold, wet, and dry, and wine was no different. So the theory was that if you, say, took a cold, wet wine and added hot, dry spices in the correct amounts, then it would become the perfect medicinal beverage, and was often served at the end of feasts to aid in digestion. A second theory suggests that the spices were added there to kind of spruce up a wine that was maybe subpar. So if you had a bottle of $2 Chuck that was about to go bad, and you threw in some cinnamon, you're good to go. But frankly, if you could afford cinnamon in the Middle Ages, you could probably afford better wine, so I don't know about that one. Then there's the third theory, which is the theory of why people do anything to their food, and that's because it tastes good. You know, pretty simple. And it must have tasted good because it was all the rage throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. But in the 1430s, Hippocras fell in with one bad dude. He was the Baron Gilles de Rais, distinguished soldier and comrade in arms of Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War. Also, arguably, history's first recorded serial killer. And I'm not going to go into details about his crimes, but in his confession, it is gruesome. Essentially, he plied hundreds of young children with Hippocras and then killed and dismembered them. Pretty disturbing, and poor Hippocras' name got dragged through the mud along with him. But just as people kept drinking Kool-Aid after Jonestown, didn't really stop people from drinking Hippocras for very long. Hippocras stayed popular through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, all the way up until the 18th century. And there was a type of Hippocras for really everyone. You had these multi-spiced wines for the very, very wealthy, and then really any that had sugar would have been for someone with quite a bit of cash. But then you also had spiced wines for the poor. They were sweetened with honey and usually bits of fruit. And that might sound familiar because we still drink wine that is sweetened with fruit today, and it's called sangria, which actually has its own fascinating history, which I'll have to cover in another episode. But while Hippocras lost favor in the 18th century, other spiced wines emerged and took up the torch, mostly in the winter months, served warm. In England, mulled wine and wassail punch made with spiced cider were, and still are, must-haves at Christmas parties. Every Weihnachtsmarkt in Germany serves Glühwein in either a tankard or these cute little ceramic boots. And in Nordic countries, they have glögg, which is still made with some of the spices that were used in that 14th century recipe from the Forme of Cury. Honestly, almost every European country and many former European colonies has some sort of spiced wine as part of their cuisine. And I'd like to think that most people aren't drinking it to balance their Hippocratic humors, but because it tastes good. Now, speaking of Hippocrates, let's see what we can use in lieu of that Hippocratic sleeve. So after a day or two, your Hippocras should be ready to strain. And now if you want to emulate that conical look of the Manicum Hippocraticum, you can get either a jelly bag or one of these. This is meant for making cold brew. They come in all shapes and sizes. This was big enough for 2 bottles for me. And I'll put a link in the description to where you can get that, but honestly, you could probably just use a regular old coffee filter. Also, a lot of the recipes have you using the dregs because, again, these spices are very expensive. So if you want, you can go ahead and use those dregs to make other things like sauces or even soap. Interesting. So now before I taste this, I will mention that this was served both warm and at room temperature. So I'm going to use that as an excuse to actually have 3 glasses. One warmed on the stove, one at room temperature, and then one that I've chilled like sangria. So here we are, our 3 glasses of Hippocras. One hot, one room temperature, and one cold. I'm going to start with the hot one, even though it's like 95 degrees out, because it's July. Let's think Christmas in July, Christmas in July. Oh my goodness, okay. So if what ails ya is that you have some sinus issues, this will cure what ails ya. Oh my gosh. I can feel my pupils dilating. Wow. Okay. Oh, that is very Christmassy. It kind of reminds me of glühwein from Germany, if you've ever had that. It's wonderful though. Definitely hot. Now let's try the room temperature one. It smells completely different. Much less spice. Much, I mean, it doesn't clear your nostrils like the other one did. Maybe they're already clear, I don't know. Okay, if you want something that will transport you back to the 14th century in a huge castle, this is it. What an interesting flavor this is. What's fantastic is there is spice to it in the back of my throat, and it's just getting more and more. I think it's those grains of paradise or maybe the long pepper. There is spice, like heat, definite heat to this drink. But then it's sweet too, because I ended up using a slightly sweeter red. I don't think it needs sugar. I don't think it would be good with sugar. I just love it as is. That is really cool. And just flavors that I've never tried before. What I'm not getting is the spikenard. I mean, I kind of didn't figure that I would, but that aromatic fragrance of the spikenard, I'm not getting that too much. Though nothing overwhelms it, which is cool. And now, the glass of cold, sangria-like Hippocras. Again, totally different. The cinnamon pops out in this one. Such different flavors. And it's funny because the hot one really cleared your nasal passages. The room temperature one had that scent, but wasn't overwhelming. This one smells very little. But the flavor is really nice. This one actually reminds me more of Christmas flavors. The middle one, not at all. The warm one, okay, but this one, it feels like, all right, let's sit down by the fire and open some presents and get drunk on Hippocras. Now I have 3 glasses to finish, and so I'm going to turn off the camera before I do that. But I wanted to thank you for sticking with me, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.